Basic Education Minister Heidi Motshekga had addressed several pressing matters in the sector. She touched on the adoption of the contentious Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill and how schools are coping with the lack of water. Heidi Giokos joins us now. She attended the briefing in Pretoria. Good afternoon to you, Heidi, colleague, and thank you for joining us. We were listening in on the press briefing, and you, of course, raised the issue of water in schools, which impacts not only sanitation, but the quality of learners' ability to learn as well. What else did the minister cover?
Yes, I think the issue around water is a big one, Cindy, and this is because a number of areas, especially here in Gauteng, have been severely affected with no constant water supply. And it doesn't seem as though the situation is getting any better. When you look at what my colleague Bulile Jones is currently doing, you can actually tell that many areas are still being affected by all of this. What's important here is that the minister has highlighted that many learners might not be in need to go to school for the full day, especially when there is no constant water supply, because it's very difficult for anybody to basically function without the constant supply of water, especially schools. There also becomes a hygiene and sanitation issue around not having water supply. As much as there are water tankers that are supplied to various areas that are affected without water, it's still not sufficient, and it still doesn't make it any easier. So the minister has indicated that they are looking very closely at the situation, but she did also raise the alarm about next week. Apparently there are going to be more issues when it comes to water, especially here in Gauteng, and the minister says they'll have to monitor that situation very closely. We shouldn't even have to be in this situation in the first place, but unfortunately it's just issues that we are now dealing with. We also know that 13 schools have been affected in the Western Cape province from that storm that hit the province last week. A number of other schools were also affected, but not directly affected in terms of their infrastructure being damaged. It's just roads leading to the schools that seem to have caused some issues around access to the school. But actual physical schools that have been affected by the storm are 13 in the Western Cape. Let's listen to what the minister had to say about all these challenges.
On the question of water, it's a major problem because schools, unlike homes, we have up to 1,000 people congregating at the same place at the same time. So if there's no water at a school, it's a major crisis, especially on sanitation, but also on drinking. So what schools have been doing, especially in the Western Cape, where they've been able to bring learners and sanitation is not functioning well, is to keep them for certain hours and give them work so that they really don't find themselves odd. Because as I say, some schools are big. You have 1,000 people at the same place, and it means you can't use your ablution blocks. In Gauteng, unless Elijah, you are aware, I've not received the report from Gauteng. The only report we have is from the Western Cape, which has been updating us about how many schools have not been able to return. What is it that they've done in return? Something like going back to your COVID plans where you feed from 5, you can, but you send work to learners so that they are kept engaged, and there's ongoing communication between the learners and the schools and between the teachers. And so the only updated information we have is from the Western Cape. In Gauteng, I've just not had the report, and I was worried this morning to hear that there's going to be lots of water shortages in Gauteng this week. And as I say, normally the response is not to keep kids for the whole day at school because it can be a health hazard if you don't have enough. So you can tank, but you can't tank for especially if you have a waterborne system like we have in Gauteng. So I still don't have a full report. I'll ask from the communication.
Heidi, Minister also said that it is 30 days until the matriculants sit for their final year-end exams, citing a number of 723,000 learners, encouraging parents and guardians to give learners support, particularly in these emotional or really stressful time in their career. Do you think that, or did she at least highlight whether schools are ready in light of water shortages and also load shedding?
Well, I definitely think that there is concern now that water shortages or water cuts has also now been added to the list of challenges that schools are facing, because we do know that previously load shedding was some sort of a challenge, and not necessarily at schools, because the minister highlighted the fact that luckily exams are written in broad daylight, so they don't necessarily depend on electricity for learners to write their exams, except when it's an exam that requires, for example, computers. But the minister has indicated that there have been in discussions with the Department of Public Enterprises to ensure that when, for example, matrics write the CAT exam, the Computer Application Technology exam, that in that perhaps 2 or 3 hour block, that there is no load shedding, to make sure that there is no interruption in terms of that examination being written or conducted. But the question was also whether or not the minister has been pushing or also supports the call for schools to be exempt from load shedding. And the minister highlighting the fact that it's very difficult for schools to be exempt from load shedding because of the place or the placement of schools. They're very in the community, and it becomes very difficult to exempt schools, because that means they would have to exempt the whole area, which then defeats the purpose of why there's even load shedding in the first place. It's very different to hospitals, because hospitals, they can find a way to exempt them due to their location, but with schools it becomes a bit of a challenge. The minister says that they are ready. There is a bit of a concern around possible leaking of exams once again, or certain questions of certain exam papers. But they are monitoring the situation, and they do hope that in terms of water cuts and load shedding, it's not going to be at extreme levels, to make sure that there is a smooth process in terms of matrics writing their exams.
Yeah, and Heidi, before we say goodbye to you, just what Minister had touched on with regards to the transformation of education. They had attended the Education Transformation Summit. They also have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But she mentioned something that stuck with me, the fact that all their efforts have been rather thwarted by all this litigation, court cases that they have lost while they're trying to implement all these resolutions. Just give us a sense of what transpired there.
Yes, so this has got to do with the Bella Bill Act, and we do know that as much as it has been passed in Parliament, it's still a bone of contention, because there's a lot of litigation and a lot of organisations, including the main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, really calling for that bill to be re-looked at. The minister is saying that a lot of work has been done, and highlighting the fact that this bill has been severely diluted. Basically, what's happening here is that you have school governing bodies who have basically authority over the school or over who is allowed access to that school. And as much as there is a want from certain communities or certain schools or certain school governing bodies to preserve, for example, the Afrikaans language, the minister is saying that, previously she was not able to interfere. There might be an African child that literally lives right opposite, for example, a school that's predominantly Afrikaans, but that child cannot go to that school because of the school governing body only allowing certain cultures or certain people that speak a specific language, in this case being Afrikaans. So the minister is saying that as much as the Constitution allows for everybody to take in whatever language they speak, there also needs to be a consideration that it's not at the detriment of other learners or anybody else. So the minister is saying that there needs to be inclusivity, and there needs to also be a consideration for if you live opposite the school, and just because you're not an Afrikaans speaker or come from an Afrikaans background doesn't mean that you shouldn't have access to that school and inconvenience the child by needing to send them to another school just because they don't speak that specific language. So the minister is saying that they are ready to go to court, and she even went as far as saying it in Afrikaans and saying, they are ready to go to court and have this discussion, because they need to look at the Constitution and need to make it a fair environment for any learner to be taught in any school. But obviously there's a lot of litigation happening at this particular point, and I'll have to relook at that and see how this whole process unfolds in court.
Thank you so much, Heidi Giokos, giving us an update. She is live in Pretoria, where Basic Education Minister Heidi Giokos earlier conducted a media briefing on the amendment bill with regards to inclusivity in the education sector, transformation, and also the fairness of the practices with regards to objections that opposition parties or like-minded organizations have as well.